Welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're tuning into something that almost feels invisible today, radio networks.
Oh, yeah,
You
definitely.
know, you might not think about them much, but they
Right.
were huge in the early days of radio,
Absolutely.
shaping information spread,
Yeah.
how nations connected,
Mm.
even how we define public versus private broadcasting, all that stuff.
Good one. Yeah.
You sent us a fascinating academic excerpt all about the development of these national radio networks globally.
Yeah.
And it's got so many details in there that I can't wait to unpack it with you.
Yeah. This source really highlights how those radio networks were just such a pivotal step in broadcasting history. We'll be looking at how different countries tackled, that challenge
Yeah.
of connecting those vast populations and,
Yeah.
and how those early decisions, we still resonate today
Totally.
in the media landscape we see today.
It's amazing to think that something we take for granted, like just turning on the radio, has such a rich history. We're going to cover some surprising facts, by the way, about those really early days of radio,
Well, yeah.
from like pirate radio stations to, the surprisingly high adoption rate of radio in the US in the 1920s, all that.
Yeah,
So get ready to hear about some truly groundbreaking moments in media history,
for sure.
and maybe even rethink how you consume information today.
Right.
So before national networks, what was it like? Was it just all static and just random chatter?
Not exactly. Picture a world of small, independent stations.
Okay.
Like universities experimenting with broadcasts,
Okay.
hobbyists in their basements, even ham radio enthusiasts out there sharing weather reports.
Wait, like early citizen journalism, but on the airways?
Yeah, in a way, yeah. And it kind of mirrored other communication networks of that time, too.
Mm-hmm.
Think about canals,
Right.
railways, the postal service. They all started local.
Yeah.
Innes, in his 1995 work, makes that connection.
Okay.
Explicitly, these systems were limited by
Yes.
geography and technology
Oh,
back then.
so early radio was just about those local communities connecting with each other.
Yeah.
Makes sense. But I'm curious about the content, though. Did any of these early broadcasts survive? I mean, I'd love to hear what people were talking about back then.
Well, it wasn't always recorded like, how we document things today,
Right.
but Ranks, in his 2002 research, highlights weather broadcasts coming from North Dakota
Oh, wow.
as early as 1914.
Really?
Yeah. So imagine, like, tuning in back then and getting your forecast, straight from a university.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
So, there was a real thirst for information, even in those really early days.
definitely.
But wasn't there a push to create those national networks? Like, what sparked that shift?
Well, it's fascinating because, you see, early local broadcasting was partly seen as a way to
Okay.
kind of counter the, what they called, and this is a quote, the assimilating pressures of national content.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's from Valens' 2002 research.
Okay.
So there was already like this tension
Yeah.
wanting to preserve those local voices, but also this allure of like a unified national narrative.
So even back then, people were worried about losing their unique perspectives in the face of a dominant national voice.
Absolutely. And that tension only grew as technology advanced.
Right.
And the idea of national networks became a reality.
Yeah.
And the big question became, who would control these powerful new networks?
Right.
And that's where we see the emergence of those two very different models, public versus private broadcasting.
The classic showdown. The U.S., of course, went the commercial route.
Right.
The U.K. went with, the BBC as their public broadcaster.
Right.
It's like choosing your own adventure in media history.
Exactly. And these two models, as Hilms points out in their 2012 work,
Okay.
they became incredibly influential, shaping like radio's development around the world.
Yeah.
It's like a broadcasting family tree,
Right.
branching out from those two distinct roots.
But this wasn't always a clear-cut, either-or situation, right?
You're right. Some countries like Canada, Australia, they end up with hybrid systems.
Right.
Their unique circumstances led them down a more blended path.
It's interesting to see how geography and politics play such a crucial role, really,
Yeah.
in media development. Speaking of unique circumstances, one detail that really stood out in the research
Oh, yeah.
was the Soviet Union's use of loudspeakers in public squares
Oh, wow.
to spread information because radio ownership was so low.
Wow.
Lovell's 2015 book
Right.
paints a really fascinating picture of this.
Wow, that's a stark example of how access to technology,
Yeah,
or lack thereof,
right.
directly impacts how information is disseminated.
It makes you think about how different like technological starting points
Yeah,
can lead to entirely different media ecosystems.
absolutely. Yeah.
And it all connects back to this fundamental tension, I think. We've
Right.
been talking about this local versus national,
Yeah.
control versus access,
Yes,
the desire to be heard,
totally.
and the power of a unified voice.
Yes, for sure.
And I imagine population density played a huge role in shaping network development, too.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, creating a network in a densely populated country like the UK,
Hmm.
it seems like a very different beast
Right.
than tackling the vast distances and scattered communities of like Canada or Australia.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. Population density directly impacts the viability
Yeah,
of the U.S. commercial model
right.
because advertisers, they want to reach the most ears possible.
Sure.
So those densely populated areas are much more attractive in that system.
Right, right. It's all about reaching those eardrums.
Exactly.
What about the eardrums in the less populated areas?
Right.
Did they just get left behind?
Well, not always. It's fascinating, actually. In cases like Canada and Australia, those public networks often ended up serving those areas that commercial networks found less profitable.
So it's like the public networks were stepping in to fill the gaps, basically,
Yeah.
left by that commercial model,
Yeah.
ensuring everyone had access to information,
Right.
regardless of their location.
Yeah,
That's a really interesting dynamic.
definitely.
But let's get specific. How did these different models actually play out in practice?
Let's take a look.
Okay, so we have these two main models, right? Public and private, but I mean, they didn't just spring up overnight.
Right.
How did countries actually make those transitions to these national networks?
It's really fascinating to see how different countries kind of navigated that transition.
Mm-hmm.
Some were pretty smooth,
Okay,
others a bit more turbulent.
gotcha.
The UK, for instance, had, a fairly straightforward shift
Gotcha.
to the BBC.
Right.
But that's partly because you had, like, various lobbying groups
Oh, interesting.
that were, like, actively pushing for that public model. They wanted more control over the content.
So it wasn't just about technology, it was about
Yeah.
power and influence.
Exactly.
Like who gets to shape that national narrative?
You got it. Lacey's 2013 work and Pegg's research from 1983,
Okay.
they delve into all this, like, political maneuvering.
Wow.
It reminds us that media is never just about entertainment.
Right.
It's always intertwined with power.
Yeah, for sure. And the BBC became quite the model, didn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Weren't there other countries that followed their lead?
Yes, definitely. The BBC's influence went beyond its borders.
Mm-hmm.
Bosch, in their 2006 research, points out that South Africa,
Okay.
for example, they modeled their broadcasting system directly on the BBC.
Oh, wow. So it's like the BBC became like a blueprint almost,
Yeah,
an example of how to create that public broadcasting system. But of course, the U.S. took a different path.
right. The U.S. landscape was much more complex.
Okay.
You had all these local and educational stations
Yeah.
trying to make their voices heard,
Right.
but commercial interests were rapidly gaining ground.
It feels like a classic, David and Goliath story almost.
Yeah.
You have these smaller independent stations just fighting for survival against these rising commercial giants.
That's a great analogy. And McChesney, in his 1993 book,
Okay.
really highlights this struggle.
Yeah.
He uncovered some pretty striking examples of how educational stations were, like, marginalized and
Right.
pushed aside.
What kind of examples were educational stations just like less entertaining?
It wasn't necessarily about entertainment value.
Okay.
It was more about, like, funding and influence.
Okay.
Educational stations often relied on, limited grant
Right.
donations, whereas commercial stations had access to all those advertising dollars,
Of course, yeah.
which gave them a lot more resources to expand their reach.
So money talks, even in the world of radio.
Unfortunately, there's often the case, and there's this one quote
Yeah.
from the director of the University of Arizona's radio station
Okay.
that I think really captures the frustration
Yeah.
of this struggle. He said, and this is a quote, "The commission may boast that it has never cut an educational station off the air. It merely cuts off our head, our arms, and our legs, and then allows us to die a natural death."
That's a powerful image
Yeah.
and quite a chilling statement. It really highlights how those economic forces were
Yeah.
really stacked against those educational stations.
Mm-hmm.
But if commercial radio was so successful in the US, did that like impact how other countries
Oh, yeah,
approach their own networks?
It absolutely did. In Canada, for instance, the popularity of American radio
Okay.
sparked a real concern about, like, American cultural influence.
It's like a media invasion. Suddenly you have all these Canadian listeners tuning into American stations.
Yeah.
And that sparks anxieties about like national identity and all that.
That's a great way to put it. McLennan's extensive research
Okay.
In 2016, 2017, and 2018, Mina Sokolo's 2008 work
Okay.
all point to this phenomenon. And it directly influenced Canada's decision
Yeah.
to create its own public network, almost
Wow.
as like a defensive measure
Right.
to preserve their cultural identity.
So it's almost like radio became this battleground for like culture and influence.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Now, what about Australia? How did they navigate this public versus private debate?
Australia's approach was unique. They intentionally chose a dual system from the start.
So they had both public and commercial networks operating side by side.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I wonder if they saw those struggles unfolding in other countries
Yeah.
and thought, we can do this better. We can create a system that balances both needs.
That's exactly what Griffin Foley argues in their 2004 research.
Okay.
They had observed the potential downsides
Yeah.
of a purely commercial system. You know, the marginalization of certain voices, the focus on profit over public good,
Mm-hmm.
and they wanted to create like a more balanced approach.
So Australia was being proactive, learning from the challenges basically that other countries faced,
Yeah.
and trying to build a system that served both the market and the public.
Mm-hmm.
That's forward thinking. But I'm curious, even with all these different models,
Yeah.
wasn't there still a downside to this shift toward these national networks?
Sure.
Didn't something get lost in that transition?
That's a really important question. We can't just, praise these networks
Right.
without acknowledging the potential drawbacks. One of the biggest criticisms is that networks, by their very nature,
Mm-hmm.
tend to homogenize content.
So instead of a vibrant mix of local voices and perspectives,
Right.
you kind of get this like more streamlined, one-size-fits-all
Yeah.
approach to programming.
Yeah, exactly.
And didn't that stifle diversity?
Yeah. You've hit the tail on the head. And this becomes particularly concerning, I think,
Yeah,
when you consider the role that radio played in shaping, like, national identity.
right.
When a network controls the narrative, they're essentially controlling how people see themselves
Wow.
and their place in the world.
And that can be a powerful tool, obviously, for
Right.
unity, but also can be dangerous
Yeah.
if it leads to the exclusion of certain groups or
Right.
viewpoints. It's like a double-edged sword.
Exactly.
Networks could connect these vast populations,
Right.
but they could also silence dissenting voices.
Exactly. And Muth, in their 2009 work,
Okay.
puts it this way, and I'm quoting here, every consensus entails some form of exclusion.
Interesting.
So even as networks were creating this sense of national unity,
Yeah.
they were also inevitably leaving some people
Right.
out of the conversation.
So it wasn't just about connecting people, it was also about like controlling the message.
Right.
Shaping the narrative in a particular way. Were there specific examples of this happening?
Absolutely. Smith, in their 2002 work, talks about how unions
Okay.
struggled to get airtime,
Oh, wow.
and certain political viewpoints were simply silenced.
Oh, it's a reminder that those power dynamics are always at play, even in something as seemingly innocuous as radio.
Yeah.
It's not just about entertainment. It's about, who gets to control the microphone, who gets to shape the story.
Absolutely. And those power dynamics, I mean, they continue to shape the media landscape today,
Right.
even as technology evolves. But let's shift gears a bit.
Okay.
What happened after the initial rise of these national networks?
Yeah.
Where did radio go from there?
So we've seen the rise of these powerful national networks, and we've talked about some of the downsides, that homogenization of content, silencing of certain voices. Did things just stay that way, or did radio find ways to evolve?
Well, radio never stood still. Even as those large networks were solidifying their power, new technologies and ideas were bubbling up, challenging that dominance.
So it's like that tension between centralized control and local voices. It never really went away. It just kept morphing into these new forms.
Exactly. Think about the rise of community radio.
Oh, yeah.
It was almost a direct response to, those perceived limitations of national networks.
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly you had these smaller independent stations popping up, giving a voice to communities and perspectives that were often, overlooked by the mainstream media.
It's like a grassroots movement, taking back the airwaves, reclaiming the power of local voices.
That's a great way to put it. And then, of course, you have satellite radio and eventually digital radio.
Right.
These innovations, they further fragmented the media landscape, offering even more choices and specialized content.
It's like the evolution of media is this constant push and pull between consolidation and fragmentation.
Yeah.
We see these large networks emerge, creating this sense of unity, but then new technologies come along and they disrupt everything, empowering those diverse voices that were pushed to the margins.
Yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic.
And today, we're seeing that same dynamic play out, I think, in the digital realm.
Absolutely.
The internet has completely transformed how we consume information.
Right.
Think about podcasting.
Yeah,
It's almost like a return to radio's earliest days with individual creators reaching these like niche audiences all over the world.
you're absolutely right.
It's amazing how technology can both like disrupt and revive old forms of media.
Yeah,
It makes you wonder, what's next for radio?
right.
Is it destined to become a relic of the past?
Yeah,
Or can it like adapt and thrive in this digital age?
that's the million-dollar question. It's hard to predict the future, but I think radio's survival depends on its ability to embrace like innovation and diversity.
So it's not enough to just keep doing what they've always done.
Right.
They need to find new ways to connect with audiences,
Yeah.
to offer something unique and valuable
Yeah,
in this like increasingly crowded media landscape.
exactly. And that might mean, experimenting with new formats, incorporating interactive elements, or even collaborating with podcasters, other online creators.
So it's about like adapting to the changing habits of listeners, understanding how people are consuming information today
Yeah.
and meeting them where they are.
Precisely. The success of any media platform, I think, depends on its ability to serve its audience.
Right.
And today's audience, I mean, they're more diverse, more demanding, and more empowered than ever before.
It sounds like radio networks face like a real challenge, but
Yeah.
also a huge opportunity if they
Right.
can embrace innovation and tap into the power of those diverse voices.
Mhm.
They might just find themselves at the forefront of this new media landscape.
Well said. It'll be fascinating to see how things unfold in the years to come. But before we wrap up, I wanted to leave our listeners with one final thought.
I'm all ears.
As we've seen, the history of radio is full of, unexpected twists and turns. It's a reminder that the media landscape is constantly evolving, and our role as consumers is not passive. We have the power to shape this evolution.
So it's not just about listening to what's being broadcast. It's about like being critical, asking questions, seeking out diverse perspectives, and even creating our own content.
Exactly. The story of radio is far from over, and the next chapter, well, that's waiting to be written. And it's up to all of us to decide what that chapter will look like.
That's a powerful message. To our listener, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep using your voice to shape the media landscape.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of radio networks.
It's been my pleasure.
And until next time, keep those ears open, those minds curious, and those voices strong.